Welcome to yet another episode of Shortcast Over Coffee. Today, my guest is Andrew Revkin. Andrew is best known for his groundbreaking work at the New York Times, where he covered climate change and environmental issues, bringing complex scientific topics to the public. Throughout his career, Andrew has traveled from the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic, witnessing the world's environmental triumphs and crises, and has sat down with the world leaders and activists alike. I have detailed all of Andrew's works in the show notes, so please check it out. In today's episode, Andrew tells us why carbon capture, though important, may not be the only thing climate scientists and venture capitalists should be after. He also shares with us his early journalism career and reporting from Brazil on environmental issues caused on the Amazon rainforest. Please do like, share, and subscribe this channel, Shortcast Over Coffee, on top podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple, etc. Now, without further ado, let's dive right in. Thank you, Andy. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, I'm really thrilled to meet you and to join in on this.
Awesome. Happy New Year. And what has changed in 2024? What are you up to?
Well, this past year was my 40th year in journalism. I started out in 1983, 82, left journalism, Columbia Journalism School, master's degree. And my first job in this arena was at Science Digest magazine, which doesn't exist anymore, as an assistant copy editor. And that year, an editor let me kind of free range around an issue related to a certain herbicide, a weed killer, that it's too long a story to tell right now, but I dug in deep. This is a paraquat. It's an herbicide. It's incredibly useful, actually, in terms of carbon storage. It gives you a way to grow a crop without having to plow. And when you plow, you can reduce the carbon value of farming. So it's like a paradox that it also is very poisonous, and not in the way that you hear persistent. It's not a persistent pesticide, but it can kill people if they misuse it. And this is pre-internet. I started calling health departments in Thailand and Trinidad and India, and lo and behold, it was like more than 1,000 deaths a year from this stuff, and a lot of them were actually suicides. It you're from India, right? Right, and
Yeah, yeah.
agriculture, farmers. Uh, there's a history of suicide attempts as kind of a statement. And the problem is if you try to do it with paraquat, it's not a statement, it's a death sentence. If you drink the stuff, you die. And so I wrote the story, and I got this National Investigative Reporters and Editors Award for my first magazine feature. That was 40 years ago. And I've been on this journey ever since. And like I just this past year, in July, I left my last kind of paycheck job. And I realized I was at Columbia University for 4 years running a program, trying to build a program on sustainability and communication, building off of what I used to do in journalism, which I still do, but like trying to figure out for everybody, what are ways to use this thing that we're connecting with here, um, that can really benefit humanity and the world, the natural world. How do you use it without being abused by it? And that program, ran out of money, the usual academia thing, and I realized that was the first time. Now I'm like freelance again. I'm my own boss for the first time since 1995. So I'd been on the staff of the New York Times. I started there in 1995, and I left there in 2000, end of 2009. I took a buyout. There've been a lot of buyouts in journalism this year and this past year, and 2009 was another one. But I went to Pace University to build a program teaching students. Blogging a Better Planet was a course I taught there for 6 years. And another one was a documentary course, taking students every spring on their break when they would normally be hanging out on the beach. We would go to places that are still neat to go, like Brazil and Belize and Curacao. This is over years, and Baja, part of Mexico, but doing films on sustainability questions. And that was great, but it was a paycheck, 6 years at Pace University, and I still kept writing for the New York Times through that time, my blog Earth. So I'm kind of like reflecting now, what do I do now that I'm in my mid to late 60s and hopefully have a decent chunk of time left? What do I do with that time uh, going forward that's most productive for the rest of the world? I'm comfortable now. I worked really hard for a long time, and we live on the coast of Maine. Just moved here from New York, the Hudson Valley, north of New York City, and I think about the sea level rise a lot because we're on a coastline is about uh, 50, 40 yards out that door is a little inlet, and the tide rises and falls about 10 feet a day, and the high tides are getting higher, because of sea level rise. So it really does bring that close focus to me. But I'm still now thinking the big change for me is now I'm free of obligation to just pay the bills. So what am I obliged to do to make the world a better place? So that's kind of where I'm at.
Hmm.
Big change.
How? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you, how does it feel to own your time, not be on a paycheck, not have this umbrella of a big corporation telling you what to do? Or probably you were never told what to do because
Oh,
you were
well,
such a senior journalist and all of that. But what does freedom look like?
well, it's a good question because as a journalist, when you're defined as a journalist, you're really zoomed in on this thing called news. You either are writing about the news that's unfolding, or if you're an investigative journalist, you're hoping to break the news, basically to be the story by revealing wrongdoing and the like, which as I said, 40 years ago, I started doing that. So the different thing now is I'm trying to pull myself back from the daily flow, which I'm very dug in on through social media, especially X, Twitter. I spend several hours a day on that platform, and we can talk about that because I think it's sort of a microcosm of the big picture challenges we face. Bad actors, good actors, charting a sustainable course for yourself and others. Um, but it's now like I'd rather than interpreting or writing the news for folks on my Substack, or I'd like to focus more and more on something that I've been digging in on for a while, which is what are some general principles, some general approaches, practices, almost like, like calisthenics or yoga, or what can a person do to navigate this information environment um, with the best odds of success and without it becoming a toxic force in your life. And these are this is part of what I used to teach at Pace University to these communications students. And there are practices, there's things, pause before you click. Is where did this information come from that you're seeing on your screen? And it's just as important to do that when it's causing you to freak out. It's just as important to do it when it's causing you to go, yeah, that's it, man. Because this psychological issue of confirmation bias and what I call narrative capture. Anyone watching this, Google for narrative capture and the name Revkin, you'll see what I mean. Where you get captured by a narrative internally, climate change is this kind of problem. And that means it can't be that because it's this. So you get locked in. And I'm just so I'll be writing more and more about how to develop your own habits and to spread them to others through social media or other means. Just say, hey, think about it this way, and the other thing is how to have a constructive conversation amid noise and a lot of difference and people coming at each other girded for war when if they just step back for a minute, there might be some opportunity to find coherence and cooperation. So that's kind of like what I'm trying to do.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you bring up a very interesting point because, I feel like in the 60s or the 70s, when we were just watching the news, we all had like one source of truth, like a
Yeah.
PBS news or whatever, right? And now there are so many news media. so much content directed at a particular narrative that and we are all slaves of the algorithm, right? So let's say we watch CNN, then we will be pushed more CNN like content and so on. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why the world is so divided is you keep on going into that rabbit hole of if you're focused on left leaning media, then you keep getting that particular content. And I feel like lack of you know a single source of truth, like a government sponsored news. I'm not saying that it's always the right thing to do because government may have agenda, but something like a crowd-funded news source like PBS or BBC in the UK uh, actually created a more tolerant world. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. A long time ago, I started comparing this transition in the information environment from in the United States, the typical 1970, 1980, 1990 version of news was some mostly white male. Walter Cronkite was the iconic one, and as saying every evening, that's the way it is. And which he literally, that was his sign off until 1982. I think that was his last show. And um, so we were all, to me, it reminds me of just eating comfort food. It's like we're all having the same mac and cheese dinner every night, and everyone was watching the same thing. And now it's like you still get your comfort food, but now it's the world's biggest buffet.
Right.
So if you like sushi or ramen or fried chicken or vegan, you'll find it there. Every possible form of news. And as you said, the algorithms are like master. We all have a private chef way just designing the food expressly for our habits. And not just to feed us the confirmation bias, but to piss us off too, because that's what takes you down the rabbit hole. As I've learned from Tristan Harris and others, um, this whole system is Jaron Lanier, his book about unplugging. The system is designed to take you down. Literally, scrolling is an invention. It's a design feature that takes you down, and we need to move up. And so that makes this all that much harder in this online space.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about getting served sushi every day. So let's say you're served sushi every day, then you may get bored of it, or you would just not know that there is something better. So it's always good to try out a pizza
Oh yeah,
yeah,
something better or something different. To
something
be com
different just to know that it exists, right?
to be comfortable with difference and to understand that that's a normal part of the human experience.
Exactly.
One of the biggest transitions in my journalism came in around 2006. I started writing about global warming and climate change by other means, like nuclear winter, meaning nuclear war making the world cold in the mid 1980s. It's a long time ago. It was 350 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere back then. And for the first 18 years on that beat, I was thriving. I was doing great. I won awards. I got a book contract, went to the Amazon, wrote a book about Chico Mendes, a murdered activist in the forest, and then I wrote my first book on global warming in 1992, and it was and I was on a roll. I was on a roll. I was being meeting people at high levels interested in those issues, and then I was at the New York Times, as I said, from 95 onward. And it didn't come until 2006, 18 or so years after I started writing about global warming, that I think that was the first time I expressly reached out to social scientists. I'd been on the sea ice at the North Pole, I'd been in the Amazon, I'd been in supercomputer centers where the climate models run, but I had never talked to behavioral scientists about how we perceive, misperceive, ignore various kinds of risks. And it was like a hammer blow. It was this one interview, the first one I really remember, was after Al Gore's movie, the movie about Al Gore had come out, An Inconvenient Truth. And the Week in Review section asked me to write a piece about why is everyone all yelling about global warming? Because that's when Senator Inhofe and others were starting to really and drum the drums of denial. And I interviewed this woman, Helen Ingram, a social scientist at UC Irvine, and she said to me very matter of factly, the things people vote on are things that are soon, salient, and certain. That's what takes you to the ballot box. And as she was saying this, I'm thinking about global warming. The dimensions of the problem are complex, long term, and
It ticks
and
none of those
murky.
boxes.
Yeah. So it was like, oh shit. And that story was called Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet, and it's easy to find online. And then I really, you talk about rabbit holes. I began a lot more reporting on the social and behavioral dimensions of the climate problem, and not just around our perception of warming and CO2 and all that stuff, but also the social reality that energy matters much more to people than long-term questions about climate risk. If you don't have affordable energy uh, to cook on, to be mobile with, to um, keep your house warm or cold, you're very vulnerable. And at the same time as I was writing about this, the behavioral science of like why people aren't worried about things like global warming, I was starting increasingly to interview people and study the energy gaps in the world and the vulnerability gaps. Poverty is the main driver of impacts of climate, with or without climate change. Poverty and the deep variability in our existing climate system create a real dangerous situation in many places like sub-Saharan Africa. And that all pulled me back from so here I am, 20, 18, 20, 21, 22 years into my journey, and the geophysical climate still mattered, but it became clear to me that without understanding the dimensions and the dynamics of the social climate, we'll all be screwed, you know. And when I say that again, it's about, when it's so easy to just tweet angrily when there's a flood in Pakistan that was devastating and really rare and potent. And to say now we need global warming to be addressed, as Secretary General and others were doing, Greta Thunberg and others. And I wrote about that in a different way. I said, yeah, climate change is changing a lot of aspects of the climate system, but think of the social vulnerabilities that have been built, not just in Pakistan, but around the world. We have surged into flood zones just through population growth and development way faster than climate is changing. And that means when there's a flood, the main factor determining losses or resilience is not up in the air or in the river. It's in humanity. And but we get locked in, global warming, it's all about greenhouse gases, stop the greenhouse gases, and problem solved is bullshit. And yet that's where a dominant side of the narrative is. So that's when I began to get punished by others, for being not being worried enough, or not being, which is not true. I'm worried in the other way. I'm just worried about the other things, vulnerability reduction. Um, but I got labeled, attacked by bloggers, by institutions like um, the Center for American Progress, which is a hyper liberal progressive think tank. They made it a mission to undercut my who would listen to me and stuff. Really interesting journey. But I think if people can take one thing away from this chat, I hope the main thing is that the climate problem has two dimensions. There's the CO2 and other greenhouse gases are changing the climate, but it's the social factors, vulnerability to flooding, vulnerability to fire, vulnerability to coastal threats, heat. Those are societal. And
Mm.
and I did a great interview with the guy, John Riley at MIT, a longtime climate scientist. And I mean, I could actually send you the clip. You could insert it. It's just so great. I said, what's the thing that even people who are worried about global warming kind of misunderstand? And he said inertia. He said, you know, basically he said if Al Gore and Greta and everyone and around the world starting tomorrow. The climate system won't notice that for decades, literally, in a meaningful, measurable way. You can't look at a hurricane or heat wave and say, ah, there it is. There's the moment. Because the dominant sources of what happens in those bad kinds of hazards is on the ground, not in the air.
Hmm.
Inertia, there's inertia in the system. And I'm not saying it's easy to reduce vulnerabilities that come with poverty and prejudice. And those are systemic, complex problems too. But if you hyper focus on carbon, you're missing that side of the solution space. And it's really important.
Isn't these effects a byproduct of increase of carbon, methane in the atmosphere? Not necessarily. What is your take on it?
Well, heat is the one, heat waves, greenhouse gases trap heat and more of them trap heat more. It's complex because CO2 is actually a minor component compared to like water vapor. If you make the air a little bit warmer, then you add more water. That results in more water vapor, which amplifies that warming. And heat waves in the IPCC reports they're the most robustly, the hazard that's most robustly linked to global warming from greenhouse gases. The others are a whole morass. Anyone who thinks the hurricane issue is super complex, and there's essentially what you've seen recently is a series of propositions about hurricanes that are not really well supported in data yet. And we shouldn't wait until we have the data. One of them is about rapid intensification. The hurricanes, as they come toward shore, now they're more apt to go over hot water because of the heating, ocean heating. And that's resulting in rapid intensification, which makes it harder to evacuate in the lake. That's a very hot issue and in question right now, but it's new knowledge. It's not well understood. If you go to Florida, I've written a lot about hurricane history, and it's very sobering. Paying attention to history, what we know about past hurricanes is vital if you want to understand current hurricane patterns and the future. And hurricane history is revealed through a body of science. Well, some of it's in records, like literally, you know, 200 years ago in the Caribbean, there were records of hurricanes hitting Jamaica. And so that's there. But there's also records in these muddy areas behind barrier beaches. So you go down to Florida, Florida's all ringed with barrier beaches. And there's usually like a muddy kind of marshy area inland. Every time you have a bad hurricane, it washes sand from the beach into the mud, and it creates a layer cake of history. Mud, 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 mud. That'd be an area, a time with no hurricanes, and then sand, and that means there was a big hurricane. And I've interviewed scientists like Joanne Muller on the west coast of Florida. There's a team based at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution that's been doing this all around the Atlantic and the Caribbean for decades. I did several big stories for the New York Times on their work. And they found, like one of my stories in 2007 in the New York Times was uh, hurricane, active hurricanes, strong hurricanes in, actually, hold on, let me get it. I'll read it out to you. Uh, Study finds hurricanes frequent in some cooler periods. And that was just one of many studies that show you that activity of hurricanes is driven or impeded by many things: El Nino, La Nina patterns, long-term cycles in the ocean circulation. And even recently, science has shown that the uptick in hurricanes in the Atlantic in recent decades, has been linked by now at least 4 or 5 studies, not just one. And I try to encourage people to avoid what I call single study syndrome. Don't latch onto the study that matches your thinking. But there's been now a big batch of work by independent scientists showing that the main factor driving hurricane patterns in the Atlantic recently is not CO2. It's the reduction in old-fashioned pollution, the aerosol pollution, sooty pollution that got cleaned up in the United States through the Clean Air Act and in Europe through similar means because of acid rain and the like. Those reductions in aerosols, which have a different relationship to solar energy, have been linked very robustly to Atlantic hurricane behavior. So that just gives you another factor showing you thinking, oh my God, there's hurricanes this year. Global warming is just fallacious and deceptive. And what it does is it distracts coastal communities from the responsibility they have to look around and say, oh, we've built what geographers call an expanding bullseye. And this is, if people can search for that term, expanding bullseye, in my name, you'll see like, I don't know how many tweets and pieces I've written. The geographers are as important to talk to if you're a journalist or if you're an investor or anybody and thinking about climate change, because geographers show you the human landscape and how it's changing vulnerability or exposure to these hazards. And, there's a long list of stories I've written and a long list of studies done by these two geographers, particularly Steve Strader and Walker Ashley, who really kind of trademarked that expanding bullseye concept and methodology. They show you that we've built so much exposure and vulnerability to these hazards. Wildfire, they've done studies on wildfire, tornadoes, flooding, hurricanes, that if you distract yourself thinking that the problem is CO2, and that is a problem, that then you're missing all these threats and opportunities. Those are opportunities that if you address them expeditiously, you can greatly lengthen the time span for decarbonization, which is going to take time and it's not going to markedly reduce any of these risks in your lifetime, let alone mine.
Hmm. Wow, that's a very interesting twist. I mean, something that I was completely unaware of. And from what I remember, I think the first intervention with nature happened with agriculture, right? I think that was the first time humans started to plow their way into the nature. And climate change is, I mean, one of the fascinating things about climate change is I know Warren Buffett puts it out that compounding is the eighth wonder of the world. And I feel like there is a bit of compounding that's happening with respect to climate change. For instance, there were these ice caps on Greenland, and they melt and they form water. And now it turns out that they are not reflecting as much sunlight because it's not white in color; it's kind of black in color, right? Because of the water, and that
Right.
is you know increasing global warming again and melting more ice. So it's sort of compounding, and for something that happens so slowly, it is difficult for people to uh, wrap their heads around. And like you mentioned, people love immediate feedback, and I think it applies to almost everything in life. They need some immediate perks or incentives for them to believe that, hey, this is happening and what we are doing is amounting to some sort of change. How hard has it been to communicate the effects of climate change, and what has changed between what you wrote in, say, the mid 80s? Because from what I remember, we were all dealing with some other problem, right? Back in those days, we were dealing with like the CFCs, the reduction in
Yeah.
ozone layer, the smog over Los Angeles. And to be fair and to actually pat humanity on the back, I think we did manage to pull some of this back. The LA skies look different. The ozone layer is almost replenished. But I think the difference is also that we could identify the single cause of those problems. Like in the
Yeah.
case of ozone layer, we knew that it was CFC. So you cut down CFC and it replenishes. So, but in the case of climate change, uh, the reasons are so uh, I don't know. Additive, cumulative, you can put whatever word you want, but there are so many parameters affecting climate change. So, how hard has it been to communicate this? And I know in a lot of your uh, videos and lectures, you mentioned that you started off with storytelling journalism, and that didn't quite
Right.
work. So, would love to hear about the whole uh, journey on how you tackled that.
Yeah. Well, I think As I said in the early, that first 18 to 20 years of my climate reporting, I was locked in, like as I think too many climate journalists are now, on the carbon. The simple model of this being a pollution problem, and also the model of this being a pollution problem with culpability. Exxon, it's these companies. There's these many studies that have tried to say there are 100 companies that have emitted 90, whatever it is, 90% of the greenhouse gases. And to me, that's absurd because I'm using some fossil fuels right now. You know, the electricity here in Maine, I'm not off. Our house doesn't have solar. We can't have it where we are. Um, so I still drive, and in Maine, it's really hard to have an electric vehicle. And so anyway, we're all part of this journey. Um, and at the same time, so you have that. The model was that, okay, it's a pollution problem. There are these bad actors. We need to use the traditional models of regulation and treaty, and that will do it. And as you say, we did that with chlorofluorocarbons. I look back at my 1988 article, the global warming cover story, and I feel kind of uh, good as a journalist and looking back and saying, I didn't miss that that article included a section that said this is different than CFCs. It's way harder. I interviewed a guy named Peter Winsemius, who was a Dutch former environment minister of the Netherlands, and I'll read it to you. CFCs are a special case, however. I wrote this in 1988. Since they are entirely man-made and since substitutes are available or under development, control is straightforward. There are only 38 companies worldwide that produce CFCs, said Peter Winsemius, former environment minister of the Netherlands. You can put them all in one room. You can talk to them. And he said, but you can't do that with the producers of carbon dioxide, all the world's utilities and industries and humanity. So it was there in that story. And that story also contained another, to be sure, kind of a paragraph about development, about poverty, about countries that were still then and are still now trying to prosper and come out of deep poverty. So what I wrote at that time was, and even as the developed nations of the world cut back on fossil fuel use, this is presuming we would, and we have in the United States, there is no justifiable way to prevent the third world from expanding its use of coal and oil. That's when we call developing countries the third world. And then I wrote, how can the developed countries expect that China, for example, which has plans to double its coal production in the next 15 years in order to spur development, will be willing or even able to change course? And then there's poverty. So I went on. So this was a complex story even then, although as I said earlier, I think I was lulled into thinking it was simple. And that pollution model of of the climate problem is a part of the problem because on long time scales, we are changing the atmosphere in ways that will have profound impacts on sea level and climate for millennia to come. The long-lived nature of CO2 guarantees that without a lot of geoengineering, a lot of carbon withdrawal that we're not remotely ramped up to do or want to do in terms of solar radiation management. So it's like it's just a much more nuanced story, and I think the way to attack it is not so much to center climate change as to do the opposite, essentially, to flip the story and look at human activities and say, well, what can we do here to reduce vulnerability and reduce our reliance on polluting sources of energy?
Mhm.
And when you do that, not only are you truer to the nature of the problem, you're also, to my mind, more apt to avoid some of these cultural divides that have become so toxic. And some of the other reporting I did a decade plus ago made that logic stronger and stronger. And this is that when words become emblems in political fights, whether it's abortion or nuclear power, it's really a more of a political thing that people argue about. They come at it with completely different frames. Global warming has become sort of like that: gun rights, gun control, CO2 rights, CO2 control. When you get into the cultural divides over this, they kind of evaporate if you just focus on, hey, how can we build a community or a country or world that is less reliant on polluting sources of energy, that is really working to fill gaps in resilience, to help communities boost their adaptive capacity, to help kids get educated so that families are not in a trap of sort of high fertility rates and exposure to dangers in the environment, whether it's pathogens or climate. And then when you do that, you're creating a landscape of a zillion possibilities, and you're not locked into this fantasy that this is going to be solved in some simplistic pollution regulation top-down way. And one way to look at what's happened around the world the last 30 years to understand this dynamic is to look at the treaty process. When I was writing about this in 1988, I went to this meeting in Toronto, the first international conference on the changing atmosphere. That's what they called it. And that preceded the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, where the first climate treaty was agreed to, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Back then, the model was all, framed around that traditional idea of controlling pollution. But at the same time, it was aspirational. It wasn't like we, the nations of the world, agree to cut carbon dioxide 20% by the year 2000. Um, because everyone knew that you couldn't get 196 countries to sign anything that had a binding contract kind of architecture. But that didn't dissuade people from seeking that, because I think we all have this like wishful, we're looking for some grown up to solve this problem for us, whether it's the UN or a national policy. And the more I followed the treaty process, and I went to many of these COPs, before they were called COPs, and uh, the more I followed this, the more it became clear that these these incremental agreements, Kyoto and which faded away, um, and then the Paris Agreement, what they're doing is they are enshrining what nations have already decided they're willing to commit to on paper. They're not determining it. And if you look at there are people around the world, scientists who study decarbonization rates, global. There's a group at IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and near Vienna, where I spent some time some years ago. They back off from the whole picture, and they're looking at like decarbonization rates of the global energy, primary energy. And it's not like you look at that and you say, oh, well, look, there's the Framework Convention, 1992. Look, it's a long slope toward improved use of energy. And it's continuing on a very much linear. There's some blips, but they're not related to policy. They're not related to treaty signings. They're related to when you integrate across all of human enterprise, including the gaps and the countries that are front runners. They're showing you that we're on a long, slow trajectory toward decarbonization. And of course, it's always too slow. We're not going to hit anyone who thinks 1.5 or 2 are two things. Anyone who thinks they're achievable is dreaming, and anyone who thinks they're meaningful is dreaming as well. They created kind of a landmark for us to think about. But they're not. Every scientist I interview in this, when you really dig in on it, says over and over again, rising emissions, rising temperatures equals rising risk, period. There, there are tipping points in the system. They're out there. But as Steve Pacala at Princeton said long, long ago, they're what he calls monsters behind the door. They're like scratching at the door. This is like, ice sheet instability, runaway methane release in the Arctic. They're plausible-ish, but anyone who thinks we're clarifying or can even clarify where some of them, where that line is also kind of fantasizing because of profound complexities and uncertainties. So, so, um, so that transition toward the normalcy of the complexity of this problem and the fact that it's a many, I've been writing recently about what I call the complexity monster. It stalks climate policy along with the scale monster. There's a scale monster and an uncertainty monster, which Judith Curry, a climate scientist, wrote about a while ago. These are normal aspects of this problem. They're not, many of them are not really reducible. And that to me takes me toward what can I do? Certainly what I've been doing with my webcasts and writing, and what can I do even better going forward? Not to tell a story, but to facilitate exchange of ideas, facilitate constructive discourse, facilitate communities understanding the true source of their vulnerabilities, and that for example, tornadoes are completely unlinked to climate change. There's some murky data showing there's more and more tornadoes in the southeast, but it's all swamped by overbuilding, building vulnerable building. So what can I do to sort of amplify the work of the guys Strader and Walker Ashley and their expanding bullseye methodology? What can I do to foster the capacity for transparent accountability on things like carbon? When companies claim carbon reductions, um, what can you do to foster reality there? And that's an exciting landscape. It's not a landscape of doom. It's a landscape of unbelievable opportunities. For people like you, as you were saying, trying to, thinking about moving into this arena in the tech side. Um, I just think, like, for example, through the treaty process, and cut me off if I'm saying too much, but in the treaty process, it was pretty clear ahead of Paris, particularly 2015, China issued some new revised estimates of its emissions and coal use, and they were higher than what they used to do. And I haven't seen papers on this, but a number of experts have said that those adjustments in their numbers almost assuredly came because there's more and more independent ways to ground truth and to use remote sensing to determine what countries are and aren't doing with their, even with coal production and coal burning. There's a website, some environmental group has been tracking Chinese power plants. You can kind of see using satellites the piles of coal and whether they're shrinking or growing, and are these plants, they're the brand new ones, are they operational or are they not operational? That's all. You can impose transparency now in the world and the wider world of conservation as well. Global Fishing Watch is an amazing innovation for tracking overfishing in waters that don't have any coast guard, near Antarctica and the like. So it becomes a landscape of opportunities. The problem is it's dispersed. It's not like me writing another cover story for
Mm,
global warming. So it's about dispersed capacity for not just for storytelling, but for information access and then for action.
Yeah. I have been following the climate tech, climate change space for, I don't know, over 10 years now. And you bring up a very interesting point that the world is running towards carbon capture and renewables and reduction of CO2 and whatnot. And that makes me thinking that are the venture capitalists of Silicon Valley who are pouring in money, calling themselves the good guys, is that because there is an economic incentive for it? And I think I quoted the same quote from Ramesh Nam's speech that, you know, the renewables are going to win the non-renewables on cost, purely on cost, if they are allowed to flourish. So is that the incentive that there's money pouring in for carbon capture, as opposed to some of the other serious problems that you pointed out, which is, more and
Yeah.
more hurricanes in the southeast?
Oh, well, I haven't written this and I need to, but I've definitely thought it and said it recently. I have a hypothesis that the carbon math and carbon ca um, finance side of the climate problem has is focused on, hyper focused on, because there's at least some semblance of measurability there. You know, tons of CO2. If you talk to geographers and disaster risk scientists and anthropologists about societal resilience and vulnerability, there's no real metrics there. You can't really. There are efforts to do this. If you go on the FEMA website, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they have a map now of like a hazard map for the United States.
Hmm.
And it has, you can click and look at tornadoes, you can look at whatever. And they also have they have a layer for societal for societal vulnerability and some other factors like that, but it's really mushy. Because the factors driving vulnerability are not, and they're not monetizable, right? And if you can't
Yeah,
measure something, you can't monetize it.
right.
Insurance industry is there, of course, but they're monetizing loss or and it's all the financial loss. It's not human loss. Think about Hurricane Harvey and Houston. If you're a poor family renting an apartment in Houston, you got flooded, you didn't have insurance. And so your losses, and you lost your job, and maybe you had to move, and your kids were set back by a year. How do you measure the lost income generating capacity of those kids who lost a year of education because they were just dislocated from their homes? I think that's a big problem. Uh, and there are some efforts to monetize all the sustainability goals, like to find measures of avoided disability and mortality from indoor cooking smoke. I think it's great. I've written a lot about that kind of stuff too, and I think that could, if you could, create a widget, a monetizable chunk of policy in Nairobi that reduced air pollution enough that that a certain number of deaths, illness and deaths were avoided. That would be fantastic. And there are people working on that, and I plan to try to write more about that. But it's clearly, at least in theory, easier on the carbon side. And as you know, and as everyone knows, with ESG, debates these days, it's easy only at the first levels. When you look at the full tier of emissions impacts of aviation, it's not just how many planes and how much of the fuel is a biofuel and like but I do think that drives this and it is money I think and some of that's good. It's like the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure has come up in your show already, and the infrastructure law. Those achievements of the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress. Uh, well, one of them was bipartisan. The $1 trillion infrastructure law was bipartisan. Those achievements, I think, people will look back and realize that really was a big kick to the system. That really has produced enormous possible change, if not change. There's plenty of greenwash and plenty of misspent money. I think the EV push is going to falter. We have a hybrid. I haven't bought an EV. I don't plan on buying an EV anytime soon because of where we live. And I think hybrids are great because they're like getting in the direction, but they still give you the range and the other issues that our EVs come up against. So, but then, and this takes me back to what I said earlier about the story not being a story anymore. And I wrote a long piece on this on my blog on Sustain What. The new communication challenge and opportunity is not telling communities there's more hurricanes coming or whatever. It's not even me telling them about vulnerability based on history and stuff. It's about what can I do or what can funders do or what can technologists do to foster community capacity to harvest these amazing bounties that are now out there because of these laws. Um, Multi-billions of dollars and as Jigar Shah, if you haven't interviewed him yet, you should. I've had,
I tried to reach out to him. I tried to reach out to the loan
yeah,
organization.
yeah,
I
yeah.
forget the
He
exact
runs,
name. Yeah.
well, I did a conversation with him with another journalist who was on my show, and it's a like a 60 second, brilliant, shining diamond nugget that
Yeah.
I could send to you that you could plug in here.
We have thousands, actually tens of thousands of people who are already active on these issues. When you think about what this takes, we have 19,500 organized cities and towns and communities in this country. That's it. 19,500. 14,500 of them have a population that's less than 5,000, right? And so what this requires is sustained effort at the local level, always, right? When the transit authority makes the decision to replace old diesel buses with something else, they need to choose electric buses. And we have programs to pay for it. But if the transit agency doesn't apply for the program, it doesn't happen. And I can't force them to do it from the federal government. All I can do is say, here are all of the resources. But someone in the local community can force them to make a decision that's in their own best financial interest. The same thing's true with the way in which school buses are done. Only 50% of streetlights in this country are LED. We could replace all the rest of the streetlights with LED lights. It's like an 8-month payback, right? The amount of school rooftops that don't have solar on them when it's fully financeable and you save money from day one, right? I mean, what it takes is someone who actually is willing to spend a few extra hours every week to say, you know what, I want to make my community better. And the federal government's passed $1.2 trillion to support that. But we can't force it top down. That's not how our country works, right? It's got to be forced at the local level with resources that we provide to that, change maker and that muckraker.
He basically says, look, this is no longer an issue of shortage. We have an abundance of resources for years to come for communities to harness, to do things like, electrify their buses, to advance heat pumps, to change their streetlights. He said half of American streetlights are still old-fashioned streetlights. He said, we have loans for that, and they pay off in like 8 months. He said, but none of that happens unless communities know about it and know how to access it. He said there's like 14,000 communities in America, and only something like 5,000 of them are over 10,000 people. And we need change makers in each one of those communities to devote a few hours a week to be the person who goes to the town council meeting or goes to the school district meeting and say, hey, our buses are really old and the kids are getting sick because of the city pollution from the diesels. And, do you know we could do X, Y, and Z? We could electrify our bus fleet or change to natural gas. Natural gas over diesel, I'll take that any day of the week for a bus with kids in it. And here's how. So that's the distributed communication opportunity. And I wrote a piece about it, but Jigar Shah says it so well in that little nugget. And I think that leads me, when you think about the vulnerability reduction that can happen at the community level, you think about the energy transitions that can happen at the community level and how that can become infectious if people who are doing that stuff then share their success and their failures with adjacent communities, or if you're in a desert landscape, what's happening in Phoenix or in Hyderabad, which have a very similar climate, I've noticed a few
Yeah.
years back. And what can you do in together, in places that have that same kind of climate zone to spread the gospel of change? Then it takes away this whole looming, doomy, paralytic, contentious approach to the problem. And basically it's by not centering global warming, which
Yeah.
is hard for people to do when that's all they wake up thinking about.
That is true. And I think the biggest takeaway from what you just said is that uh, there is an incentive for companies monetarily if they reduce carbon, but also reach some KPI metrics that they are tracking, or put some slides in their PowerPoint and be like, hey, we reduced carbon by 10% or 15% or whatever that is.
Right.
But in the other case, there isn't much incentive other than the minor incentive that insurance companies have, if they can reduce natural disasters and stuff. Yeah, I think it brings up goes back to our previous point where climate change is not quantifiable, and it turns out that carbon reduction is probably the only thing that is quantifiable, and not the other one. And also, you brought about a very interesting point about the residents of an apartment not falling sick as often due to kitchen smoke. But it is so hard to prove, right? Sometimes they will be like, yeah, what if this wasn't there? I would still be okay. Like, what is the proof that this is what helped me stay healthy for longer? So again, not as quantifiable. I don't know if someone can come up with an idea to quantify it, that'll be great. But yeah, it's very tricky.
This has come up. My wife, her last career was training teachers how to teach sustainability and how to incorporate sustainability concepts into their existing lesson plans. And her organization, like many, is always looking for money, right? And if you want money in this arena, you have to present metrics. But when you think about improved education, this is kind of like avoided disasters, measuring an avoided loss, something that didn't happen. It's kind of the inverse of measuring education success, because you have to wait 10 or 20 years to see what happens with these kids. And the real metric of the real way to gauge access to education or the lack of it, that only comes through longitudinal study. And so in some of these arenas, we have to get comfortable with diving in based on trajectory and basic understanding of what works and doesn't work, and not think it always has to be measured. And actually, one way to think about that in terms of disaster risk reduction in zones, whether they're vulnerable to earthquakes or climate, is just to focus on poverty reduction, because it's so linked in so many ways. And then it's like some of these are just cultural things. Like this is from earthquake reporting. I've done a lot of earthquake reporting and other geohazards. And the earthquake in Nepal and around Kathmandu in 2015, I had been already writing about how do you make buildings that don't fall down in earthquakes, especially schools. My reporting there goes back not as far as my climate reporting, but almost. And after the Sichuan quake in China, when these schools fell down and so many thousands of kids and teachers died, I really hyper-focused on that. And one of the things you want to do in a building, if it's made of reinforced concrete, is basically reinforced concrete columns or vertical cement concrete column, and then there's like iron bars in it, and then there's loops of iron that go around those bars. And there's a certain little thing you have to do with that loop going. You have kind of spaghetti here, and then string around the spaghetti. And if you don't tie the string right, and if you build a spaghetti building, it'll all fall down, earthquake. So there's a little detail. It's called a ductile detail, and it's basically the ends of the rod going around the iron vertical parts have to be bent at least 120 degrees, not 90 degrees. 90-degree bend, as that ground is shaking, that comes undone and the building can fall. And in the Nepal quake, a guy I've gotten to know, Kit Miyamoto, who's an engineer, very successful structural engineer in San Francisco, but he also goes around the world looking at earthquake disasters. And he went to Nepal and he saw this, not a building that had fallen down, but a new building. And it had the right bend. And he said to me via Skype, that's a sign. You see, they're changing how they build their buildings. And it was a building that was just literally being built. And he was very excited about it. And we talked about, what are the factors that likely led to that? And they're cultural. It's not Nepal has building codes. They just don't have inspectors and follow through, enforcement. So that what you do have increasingly is an understanding in the building trades that this very simple thing that doesn't involve like more stuff, it's not fancier rods, it's just a tiny little detail. If you build a building that doesn't do that and it falls down, the community is going to come after you. And that speaks to the power of cultural change around climate as well. There is a community somewhere in Florida. I should write about it. They've built it from scratch to be hurricane resistant and also ecologically sound and low carbon. Finding ways to do the profitable thing, housing shortages are everywhere, and make it also resilient and clean energy. And then tell, how does that propagate? Those are wonderful things to think about.
Yeah.
And the cultural change can really matter. And that's why I don't go to bed all bummed. I mean, I tend to go to bed kind of bummed out and wake up each morning kind of, in good spirits. But I see every possibility around the world of getting things not just less bad, but a lot better through
Mm.
the coming decades.
Andrew, you have traveled quite a bit around the world, and one of your significant pieces of reporting came from the Amazon rainforest. What did you learn? What made you go to Amazon rainforest in the first place?
Well, in the 80s, I was a young magazine journalist, and science journalism was booming, and I was having a good ride there. I did that story in 1988. But I think around 1985, 86, I did a piece on diet and health, like how we learned what foods are good and bad by studying diets around the world. And an agent, a literary agent, had gotten in touch with me at that time, said, "Are you thinking about writing books?" And I wasn't at that time. So I just kind of put it away in a file. But by 1980, 88, the same year I wrote my global warming story, I was starting to think about books. And so I met an agent, and Chico Mendes had been assassinated December of 1988 in the Amazon, and we were mulling that as a possible focal point for a book. And I hadn't been to the Amazon. I didn't speak Portuguese, but I was in my early 30s and thought, well, why the hell not? I'll write a proposal. And I wrote a proposal, and a much more established writer, Alex Humatoff at Vanity Fair, right around that time wrote this epic story about Chico Mendes. And, I thought, oh shit, he'll get the book. And, but then it turned out what it did, I learned something about media. His story generated so much interest that it actually made more publishers interested in writing books. And so even though I was a novice, hadn't written a book yet, I got a contract to write this book about Mendes, and I scurried to do some intense Portuguese courses. This is way before Babbel and apps. And I found a young Brazilian botanist grad student who had already been in that part of the Amazon, and he was studying in New York. And I said, "Would you like to go with me? I'll pay your way and stuff." And he became my sidekick and translator and cultural translator. And we just went. I was in the Amazon for almost 4 months, and then around the rest of Brazil, reporting out, who was Chico Mendes, where did he come from, who killed him, and where do we go from here? And it was this sort of broader story of the Amazon, the past and future of the Amazon basin. And it came together. I could never repeat it. I got back from that trip. I'd had some illnesses and things, and went to my tiny Brooklyn apartment, and wrote 100,000 words in 100 days. And that I thought from then forward, okay, I'm going to be a book author, and going from book to book. And that pattern didn't persist. That's why I ended up at the New York Times. I thought I could do the freelance thing and just write books, but I got interested and just through necessity, I needed a job. And this paper, the New York Times, when it was still thriving printed publication, had a regional office in the Hudson River Valley, which is where I was living at the time, and I got this job. And I started out writing about New York's water supply, the future of the water supply, and smog and other pollution. And then I navigated back to climate. By the year 2000, I became sort of the lead climate reporter for the New York Times. Went to the North Pole, went to Greenland, and went into nuclear power plants and wrote a lot about innovation and the lack of funding for research. I had a big page one story in 2006 also on declining research budgets in an age of global warming. And I laid that out pretty compellingly. And then in 2007, I started my blog at the Times because I started to realize, trying to jam this climate monster into a conventional news article was implicitly a distortion, and also couldn't convey the true dimensions of the problem. And the blog allowed me, .earth I called it, and I did nine years of that. The first 3 when I was still a news reporter, and then 6 more when I was teaching at Pace University for the opinion section. I wrote 2,810 posts, vetted about 100,000 comments, and personally, there was no staff for that or an algorithm for that. And I learned so much more by doing that. That process actually exposed me to constructive input, and some unconstructive input. But voices saying, you should really look at this, or it became clear that a conversation with readers was of value to me as much as to them. And if you Google for the phrase selfish blogger and my name, you'd find some stuff I touched on this. I was a selfish blogger because it was as useful to me as it was, I felt, to my readers. And so that's that part of the journey.
Yeah. Do you follow the developments in Brazil now? The reason why I'm asking this is it was all about rubber farming back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And then Lula da Silva came, and then now it's all about soybean cultivation in Brazil and destruction of the Amazon rainforest. So, are you following it? Do you still have
Yeah.
connections in Brazil? Yeah.
I am. I mean, I haven't been back. I was back in 4 years, maybe 2018, for a journalism conference, and met up with some of my old colleagues, the people I'd met who were great sources back then, and I've written about the Bolsonaro effect, and at National Geographic, I did a piece when he was poised to take office, laying out the possibilities and problems, and on my blog recently, after the murders of Dom Phillips and Herrera, an advocate for the indigenous people, I did a long dive on that, on the violence and who is driving it. And it's very easy to say, oh, Lula's in office now, all will be well. And there are signs that the deforestation rate has ticked down from where it was under Bolsonaro. Although I will say it's important to remember that even under Bolsonaro, the increase was nothing like what we saw when I was there in 1990. And the murder rate in 1990, Chico was one of, I think, 1,000 people assassinated that year, 88. So that you haven't seen anything like that in Brazil since then. And yet, it's a really important problem. And the pressures on the Amazon are fundamental, primordial. It's a country, it's a big chunk of Brazil is that territory, and it's still largely unpopulated. And the military in Brazil are still eager for it to become fully, integrated as part of Brazilian territory. Way back when I was there was this line, Occupy so as not to lose. Ocupar para no entregar. And that's driving things almost as much as just the resource push, the soybean cultivation and the like. Um, and I think one thing there too that there's lots of complexities. Like there are indigenous communities in the Amazon who, especially in the soy area, the south, not really the full forest, but in the Pantanal and other areas, who have signed deals with soybean producers to use their land to produce soy. And they argue, look, our kids are going to go to school. We have healthcare now. We have infrastructure coming in because of this soy-based economy, and we're indigenous. And how dare you tell us what to do with our land? There's actually this bizarre paradox in Brazil where there's an agency for indigenous rights, and then there's the environmental agency, and they've actually been clashing over this kind of issue. And to me, the indigenous prerogative should dominate. If an indigenous group there feels that it's their right to develop for soy cultivation, who are we, certainly you or I, or anyone outside of Brazil, to tell them no? This whole anti-colonial push is underway, and if climate anti-colonialists also have to acknowledge, um, oh, if you're all into indigenous rights, that means you're into the reality that in the Amazon, some tribes actually want to be modern. They don't live in the forest harvesting marginal, income from Brazil nuts and rubber. So that's part of the complexity. And the disturbing reality is in the Amazon, the Bolsonarista culture is not just about Bolsonaro. It's like Trumpism is not just about Trump. Trump occupied a space pulled in by people who are eager for the old days, for control, for some top-down figure who hits their cultural buttons. And Bolsonaro is basically similar to Trump in that sense, but it's not like if with Bolsonaro out of power, the Amazon is now all about Lula. Not at all. So that tension is still there, and I think the encouraging things are that there's a big chunk of industry, agricultural industry in Brazil, that is beholden to markets in France or Europe, where they really do have to start to live up to pledges to not have deforestation-based beef. That you have to demonstrate if you're going to grow cattle, it didn't come from newly cut forests. And when you combine that with remote sensing, the capacity to use satellites and other means to track impacts on the ground, having trustworthy supply chains, having a vigorous journalism environment, and or indigenous communities with their own ability to alert the world to problems. I think that can lead Brazil toward a truly sustainable future for a chunk of the Amazon, not the whole basin. Uh, it's going to be developed just like it's to me. I think I wrote this at one point. For us in the States, think about the Amazon and Brazil the way we think about Alaska and the United States. It's a vast area. It's a frontier. It's full of resources and full of wonders, natural wonders and indigenous wonders. And but it's all out there. It's not really. It's not. Very few Americans have gone to Alaska, and I've been lucky to go there a couple of times. And very few Brazilians. For them, the Amazon is just this frontier. It's abstract. So the more we can do to use communication innovations to connect indigenous people with the outside world and make sure that rules are enforced and that companies are honest, the better off we'll be.
Hmm. How was press freedom like in Brazil?
When I was there, or
Yeah, when you were there.
well, it was interesting. I interviewed the murderer. I interviewed these powerful ranchers who likely bankrolled the murderers. And at that time in 1989, I got the strong sense that they didn't see me as a threat, you know, that they were so entrenched and in the power elite that they were happy to talk to me. And I mean, none of them said, "Hey, yeah, we killed him," but a couple came close to that, saying, this one the grandfather of the young man who shot Chico Mendes. I did this unforgettable interview with him on his front porch in Chavarri, the town where Chico Mendes lived and died. And he said, "Yeah, Chico Mendes spent too much time alive." I mean, he said this in Portuguese, but and he said, in the Amazon, he said, if you someone does you badly, if someone hurts you, you go to the police and nothing will happen, or you pick up a gun. And it was kind of, but he was happy to talk to me, and so that, and obviously, as I said, Dom Phillips, this journalist, really brilliant writer, was murdered brutally as part of the fish mafia in a different part of the Amazon just this year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And that's just one instance of many. It's nothing like Gaza, or where journalists have been, dozens have been killed. But I I think in Brazil overall, it's a pretty vigorous and open journalism environment still.
That's good to know.
And by the way, there are great institutions like there are these networks for journalists there across the Amazon that have done really interesting collaborative work. The Pulitzer Center, which is based in Washington, has funded many, many, many journalists going into the Amazon to track deforestation and human rights issues. National Geographic Society still gives out a lot of grants to do that. And also very much so more to support local journalists, not the old model of someone like me flying in and parachuting in and going, hey, taking notes and then leaving. That's not the model for journalism that we need.
That is so good to hear. I mean, I actually had no idea how the press freedom was like, but this is definitely encouraging. I want to move to this topic of climate denials, or deniers rather. And so from what I note, I mean, I think Alex Epstein comes to mind, is that very well learned, very highly erudite people are climate deniers. And I sometimes wonder why they would be so, because there is so much research and science to back it. But do you sometimes feel that they're using their erudition to just create a narrative, and deep down they do believe in climate change? Have you had some conversations with climate deniers?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Many, 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 many. In fact, I just did an episode of my show a month or so ago with Alex Epstein. And you look it up. And I talked to him for a long while, and I and then I was on that 4-hour interview with Lex Friedman and Bjorn Lomborg, who some label a denier. I think he's much more nuanced than that. So
I don't think that was a debate, really. I think
no, it wasn't, even though it was labeled a debate. We were clearly finding lots of room for agreement. And I think the more we try to shift this landscape away from win-lose debates, the better off we'll be.
Yeah.
But just to back away and address your core question, there's no single version of denial around this issue. And there are opportunists who are making money off this issue, just like with every other issue, like the vaccines and pandemics. People sometimes come in and just see an opportunity for clicks and attention and money, and there's a little bit of that on the other side of the climate issue too. People are trying to get attention through doom, but focusing on those who really are trying to challenge the idea that there's a climate problem. I think there too, there's a mix. Alex Epstein, he's a young guy. His background's in philosophy. He loves Ayn Rand, and he's a libertarian, and so he has found amid the murk around the climate issue, there's plenty of opportunities to create talking points, which is what he has a whole website of talking points now, and he backs up his talking points with these big volumes of stuff. And what he's done is essentially carved out of the gray zones around the climate problem a narrative, as you said, that's all about these, these people are trying to sell you a bill of goods, a costly change that is harming communities that don't have enough energy. And as I said earlier, that chunk of what he says is right. If you start with energy access, energy vulnerability and climate vulnerability are the same or similar, around the world. Finding ways to reduce that vulnerability. Who can't afford heating or cooling in a hot or cold climate? Who can't afford to live safely? It's easy to make the argument to sort of carve out of that climate space that argument, and say, all those resources, all the resources that we were talking about is a good thing. He would say are just distracting us from ways to make people's lives better right now. And Bjorn Lomborg does a little bit of that too. He's like, his whole thing through his career has been saying you have to do a cost benefit analysis. Like if you have $1 billion, if you're going to spend it on mitigating carbon, that's not helping anybody in the next 10, 20 years. And he's right. He's right. Because it's mostly decarbonization is really mostly about the future. Unless you're talking about the secondary benefits like cutting sooty pollution, from coal. But that can be done without cutting the carbon, So if you're so he has a way to frame a pretty valid argument around that as well. If you just do a cost benefit analysis. And that requires you to discount the future in your cost benefit analysis. But the world mostly does discount the future. We the carbon the idea of a social cost of carbon. Now it's really high. Under Trump, he wanted to take it down to like $5 a ton, and now it's I think they just said $230 a ton. That's not a function of any. That's so much less a function of science than it is of politics. And David Roberts actually on a show I did a while back, he made a good, and on years ago at Grist, he wrote a really great piece on how carbon accounting the discount rate, which is a big part of setting a carbon price, is really masquerading values judgments behind numbers. So what I'm saying there is, let's get back to your main point about denial. There are people who are opportunists. There are people who are politically framing their arguments. Senator Inhofe for decades in an oil state, Oklahoma, rode that he loved Al Gore because Al Gore gave him a crash test dummy to throw things at. And then there are people who are, as you see anywhere on the internet, who are just like with Trumpism, who are so bought into denial that they can't afford to think about the data, and that, and again, lately, like Michael Mann, really one of the dominant climate scientists of recent decades, he spends, I'd say, a third of his time online going after doomists, or they go after him for not being doomy enough. They're in denial. They're in denial of the data just as much, and probably mostly culturally, as the people who think the world isn't warming. So that I don't tend to use the denial label even because I see so many flavors of it, and I just try to break it down. It's like with everything, the more you can kind of step back from generalizations and look at particular cases of people's behavior and attitudes, the more you can do that, the less likely, the more productive I think you can make things. Making this out is like unfortunately, like Hillary Clinton with her deplorables, basket of deplorables. Generalizations are a terrible fit for this arena because you're going to actually push away people by putting them in one basket with someone who's more extreme. Then that's actually making your job worse. And there's science to back this up. I guess circling back to what I call the scariest science. There's a piece on my Substack with that title. The behavioral science, Dan Kahan, Kahan, who's kind of gone silent lately, but decade ago, he did all these empirical studies showing that climate literacy, understanding the basics of, what's a greenhouse gas, et cetera, is highest at both ends of the spectrum of climate belief. The most, the most people who are most dismissive and most worried tend to have the highest climate literacy because they're engaged, right? And this big mass in the middle is like, they don't know anything about greenhouse gases or carbon, just like we don't know anything about evolution or genes, in America. So it's like, and that was really disturbing to me as a journalist when I started to understand that basic climate literacy, if my job is to make people more climate literate, and I don't think that's my only job, but for those who are, if you think that's going to take away this divide, it's fantasy when you look at the data. And his work, he had a website for a while called Cultural Cognition, which is basically says, when you think you're thinking about something, you're mostly feeling about it, and that's based on your predispositions, your cultural attachments, your tribal behavior. Um, so I tend to back away from thinking of climate denial and belief, and if we have more belief, then we'll have a better outcome, and more into thinking about the person you're engaging with. Let's talk a little bit. When you say climate emergency, what is the emergency in your head? For me, it's more about vulnerability. But let's at least try to sort of understand each other's stances a little bit before we get into a raging argument about what to do. And that's where there was a great, unbelievable report by John Sutter in the run up to the Paris meeting that generated the Paris Agreement, 2015, 2014, did a series for CNN called 2 Degrees. And he went around the world writing great pieces. He's from Oklahoma originally. And so he saw the data from Yale and its partners, the Yale Center on Climate Communication, that found that they did a county by county assessment of survey results in the United States. And the most skeptical county on America, you could say the county in climate denial, in the greatest climate denial, Woodward County in the oil patch, was the most skeptical county in America. And so he went there. And he did these stand-up interviews with folks. Just who are you? What do you do? And where are you from? And what do you think about weather? What do you think about climate? What do you think about energy? Just general questions. And it was so illuminating because there's this guy he interviewed who's worked at an oil company, who was a fundamentalist creationist who believed that, the world is 6,000 years old, who believed that so much that he helped to fund a little kiddie park in the town that has dinosaurs and people like all standing around together. And he starts talking and he says, God controls the environment. And through the first minute or two of the interview, you, the viewer, are thinking, oh my God, this is hopeless. And then he says, we have half of our roof covered with solar panels and we plan to get off the grid entirely. And, it stops you as a viewer. You go, oh, that's interesting. Until you realize, he's libertarian. The reason he wants to get off the grid entirely has nothing to do with climate. Because why should he pay a check to a utility when he can be a good, righteous, self-reliant American and generate his own electricity? And but of course, that same dynamic in him is why he would probably never vote for. I mean, I know he would never vote for Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. He's about individuals, not about government. And the big meta lesson there is, if you go into Woodward County, Oklahoma, with some climate emergency signs, you're just going to make enemies out of possible friends. If you go in there, say, have a town meeting, say, wow, that's interesting. You have solar panels. Let's talk about that. What can we do to have the poorer parts of this community have solar as well? Or, how can we make the most out of the Inflation Reduction Act? And I'm sure you've seen the data recently that most of the money from that act so far has gone into Republican districts.
Yeah. I mean,
Even
I was having this
ones,
discussion with David Roberts, and we were talking about how, Texas and Iowa are the most
yeah,
renewable energy reliant states.
yeah, and not about climate. I just was having a Twitter conversation with slash debate with some people about that, and Iowa, right? Iowa's gotten. If you look at these graphs, you see Iowa's coal use has plunged, and its wind has supplanted coal,
Yeah.
and and none of that has to do with climate. And I when I was at ProPublica briefly for a year in 2017 after Trump got in office, um, Obama's what was it called? The
Clean
Power
Air Act,
Clean
probably not.
Power.
Yeah.
Obama had a policy coming out that a bunch of states, red states, were fighting in the courts. And some groups did an assessment and found that 17 of the 22 states that were fighting Obama over power plant regulations were already on track to meet the renewable energy pathway under that the Obama administration was foreseeing. And again, but none of the politicians were willing to like acknowledge that. And there's even at another level, I've written about studies out of Yale, the surveys that show that there really are no red and blue states when it comes to clean energy. That people want clean energy, duh. And not only that, there's no red and blue states over like more research for solar and renewable energy. There's no red and blue states over regulating CO2 as a pollutant.
Yeah. This is the only thing people agreed upon from the Build Back Better Act, right?
Yeah, if you
Climate is
right.
the only thing.
Yeah, yeah, because everyone recognizes infrastructure gaps and archaic uh, utilities and the like, and again, to me, that sort of goes back to this thing. I don't regret my reporting journey. I don't regret all these stories that I did that are like this. Global warming, global warming. Um, but as I wrote recently on my Substack, the last thing we need is more of that. What we need is community access to information that matters, whether it's getting the resources from the IRA or whether it's charting your vulnerabilities to wildfire so that you can have more saner coastal policies in a world where sea levels are going to be rising for centuries to come. And the rate at which that happens through this century is highly uncertain. It still is, despite some proclamations that, oh my God, now we know it's going to be 10 feet or something. That's bullshit. It's bullshit. And I wrote another piece saying, look, here's what we know about what sea levels are going to do by 2050. So get busy. And then as you get busy, then you start to understand it's not like we're building to a new standard. We're not building to a new sea level. You have to build to having no new sea level. It's like with climate change itself. We have to get comfortable with a changing climate, even as we try to modulate that change. And that's requires being comfortable with saying some young people, should go into universities thinking about that, not just about punishing Exxon. And the full dimensions again reveal a great prism of opportunities, and it's just not like. And I wrote some pieces chiding young people, not just young people, old people who are lying down on the highways outside of Washington and Extinction Rebellion. The opportunity cost and the fact that in many of these places they're alienating people who could be their allies. Strikes me as a real problem. But I'm not saying, free speech is fine and free protest is fine too. Just be cognizant of your strategy and understand that you might think you're making a difference, but maybe you're actually making things worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating, like you said, the red and the blue states are in complete agreement. But sometimes what happens is the technology goes too far, technology catches up, but at the same time, the policy making and bureaucracy is not, uh, in line with climate tech. So it can sometimes pose an impediment to technology just because the policies are not lined up. And I think that's similar to that's something that we are facing right now, right? I mean, technology has improved, but at the same time, policies have not caught up.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I've touched on off and on is, as I said earlier, I've written a lot about innovation and the role of science, basic R&D and development and demonstration, and the deep underfunding there. But what I haven't seen, and there's an enormous gap in, is science and focus on social innovation. Like how do you look at how energy flows and think about what you can do, whether it's with the utility bill or, as we said earlier, access to heat pump technology and the financing around it, models for um, assessing different approaches to energy transition. Like when I was in the Hudson Valley, there were these community choice aggregation uh, possibilities where you as a community you could buy energy through the grid, but all renewable. And the little village that we lived in was mulling that, but other villages had already gone through the learning curve. And so, what can we do to facilitate village to village, town to town, community community sharing of best practices for how to think about transitioning to clean energy? Like that doesn't get enough funding and attention. In fact, on a show I did a couple of years ago, um, some of my colleagues when at Columbia at the Center on Global Energy Policy had as Biden was coming in, the Biden administration was forming, they came out with a manifesto. Here's how to think about innovation for clean energy. And I reached out, I had them on my webcast, but at the same time, I brought in Indra Overland over in Europe, who's a social scientist who had co-authored a study showing that, like this, if you look at the whole pie of money that goes to energy, clean energy research, and decarbonization research, really, social and behavioral science is like this tiny, 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 tiny sliver, not even a wedge of that. And so we're not even asking the questions. We're not funding the research to understand what, as some back a decade ago talked about, a behavioral wedge of avoided emissions. There's a wedge model of you have, what you can do with nuclear, what you can do with the grid, what you can do, and there's this behavioral wedge of what you can do with behavior change to cut pollution. We're not really studying it. There are. I could probably, with some work, I could list you 36 people I know who are working in that arena, but they're working with marginal budgets, and often their work is discounted by the wider science community. And part of that is because they're called the natural sciences. This is so weird. Physics and the sort of fundamental scientists don't even talk the same language as social and behavioral scientists. The social and behavioral scientists have data they talk about qualitative data. And like to me as a journalist, I don't even wow, that's weird. And what it is like surveys, interviews. Right. If you're a social scientist, you interview 100 people, you're getting data. But it's not like you can do a plus or minus X kind of analysis of the data. So that area needs there's a huge opportunity, I think, to do more work like that, to get more young people, scholars, to fund, to support that work. And I did early in my webcasting, I did one with some postdocs at Columbia who had written a paper in Nature Sustainability, basically a manifesto, a commentary, basically saying this is what academia should do to foster interdisciplinary community-based research, which is what we're talking about, access to energy, community-based work on how people behave or misbehave around energy, et cetera. And the list of things that impede that kind of research in universities is huge. And it's like there are all these disincentives to do it, especially for young scientists. And that needs to be addressed for sure. And it's, the simplest one is time. Megan Maurer, I think, Maurer, Maurer, talked about, it takes more time to do interdisciplinary research. One, you have to learn each other's language, the disciplines. And then for community-based work, you have to learn the community's language. You have to be comfortable in the community. They have to be comfortable with you, and that all takes time, and no one has time. So that there's a lot of work to be done, and it's if it's a layered it's a layered system. That work wouldn't translate to some big success quickly, but it's the kind of thing that has to be done if we really. Otherwise, we're just flailing around. I'll give you one last example. You know, Ed Hawkins in England, he's done these warming stripes. You've seen this climate history through stripes of cooler and hotter colors. It's all over the place. It was on the cover of The Economist magazine. It's been on buildings. And I did a conversation with him and a German collaborator and others on visualizations of climate data. And I included a young PhD candidate in Ulrike Hahn, who's studying, how art does or doesn't matter. And basically, no one knows. Like these stripes are everywhere, but are they doing anything? No. Do we know? And what could make a difference? That's really important questions. So we can just flail around and pat each other on the back about our cool visualizations and initiatives and stories, but it's good to kind of at least figure out when we're doing it on faith, which is fine, as opposed to doing it because it's really meaningful.
Andrew, extremely profound conversation. But before we end this podcast, I would love to know about your upcoming travel. Tell me more about it.
Yeah, I haven't done much lecturing the last few years, not just because of COVID. And I've been involved in National Geographic for many years, and I've been involved with the sea for all my life. I sailed 2/3 of the way around the world when I was 20 to 24 years old, 22, 24. And I grew up loving the ocean. So this year, early in the year, late January, early February, going on a cruise out of Auckland, New Zealand to the Solomon Islands. It's a Lindblad National Geographic trip. And I'm going as a lecturer on that trip. But I'll be eagerly learning. Solomon Islands are very vulnerable to tsunami, earthquake. They're high island. They're not really sea level island issues. But there's a lot of coral there. It's vulnerable to heating, and it'll be an opportunity to see a chunk of the world I would never get to otherwise, and could never afford otherwise.
Yeah, it's extremely isolated. Yeah. I don't even know if we have a direct flight from the US to Solomon Islands.
No, we're flying to Auckland and then going on the boat.
Awesome. Yeah, would love to talk about your trip once you're back.
Yeah, no, we should do more of this, and I should interview you.
Absolutely, would love that.
Yeah.
Andrew, what a profound conversation. Like I said, uh, yeah, it's been an educational journey for me as well, because even I was focusing all on carbon capture, uh, connecting the grid, move to renewable. But I think you definitely showed the other side, which is vulnerability. And I think that's one of my biggest key takeaways from this podcast. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, and carbon capture matters too. Again, it's the scale monster is a huge influence on that area. And the cost at scale is, but you can't discount any of these parts of the problem. I mean, the final thing, as I said earlier, is it's a prismatic, multidimensional beast, and that just the downside is it's huge and complex and monstrous, and the good side is that means everyone could do something to help address it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I hope we all come together and do what is necessary.
Good. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.